sobs of the violins of autumn wound my heart with a monotonous language.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Today at 1, we're live in Ukraine as Russia invades in a major military assault by land, sea and air.
It's now more than a month since the US Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. China's ambassador to Australia also issued a blunt warning a few days ago that those who push for Taiwanese independence will be punished.
We're waiting for a peaceful reunification, but we cannot rule out other options.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore.
Welcome to Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight, the show where we speak with those on the front lines of defending democracy. New episodes drop every Friday. If you value this work, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a review. It makes a huge difference. You can also support us on Patreon, Substack, or Buy Me a Coffee. Paid supporters get episodes a week early. Also, check out my work on the Dictators v Democrats Substack and YouTube channels, where I cover every front of the global fight for democracy, and join our Discord community. Now, let's find out why they fight. Welcome to this episode of Why We Fight. I'm very pleased to be here today, joined by Dr. Mark Clifford, who's the president of the Committee for Freedom in the Hong Kong Foundation, and holds a PhD from the University of Hong Kong, and has spent many years in the territory, working in the territory as both a journalist and now an advocate and academic. Dr. Clifford, welcome to Why We Fight. Very glad to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
For listeners who may not know you, I gave you a brief introduction. Could you tell us a little about the journey that you've taken from journalism in Hong Kong to leading the committee?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's been an unexpected journey. I often think of myself as the accidental activist. I lived in Hong Kong for 28 years. I arrived in 1992, just 5 years before the British were going to relinquish the colony to the Chinese. I watched the great expansion of freedom under the last governor, Chris Patten, who finally, after 150 years of British colonialism, started moving seriously to introduce democracy to the colony. Worked for some foreign publications, the Far Eastern Economic Review and Business Week. I was the editor-in-chief of the 2 English language newspapers sequentially, also the publisher of The Standard. And then I ran a group of Hong Kong-based group of business executives, the Asia Business Council. I had known early on in 1993, I met a remarkable textile garment retail entrepreneur turned media entrepreneur, Jimmy Lai. And he went on shortly after I met him to take his success in a magazine and basically piggybacked on that to found a newspaper, Apple Daily, which became by far the largest and most important pro-democracy publication in Hong Kong. I later went on the board of the parent company, Next Digital, did quite a lot with Jimmy, sessions like this. In fact, after the Chinese authorities imposed a vague, sweeping, draconian national security law in 2020, and I was a moderator for a number of quite extraordinary sessions with Jimmy and people from around Hong Kong and especially around the world, from people like Nathan Sharansky, the legendary Soviet refusenik, to Chris Patten, the last governor, to Cardinal Joseph Zen, the most prominent Catholic in Hong Kong and a great freedom fighter. And anyway, I left a few months after the national security law came in. This was the end of October 2020. I left Hong Kong for what I thought would be a temporary trip to the States to see family at the end of that first horrible pandemic year. And for a variety of reasons, more related to politics than the pandemic, never went back, and don't think I can go back under the current situation in Hong Kong. Jimmy, one of the things that prompted that was the fact that authorities, about 6 weeks after I left, put Jimmy in jail. He's been in prison nonstop since December 31st, 2020, most of that time in solitary confinement. He's a guy in his late 70s who has only worked for freedom, has been a staunch proponent of nonviolence, and is a guy who's just driven by his values, his belief in the rule of law, and above all in freedom, as I say. And that's just been such an inspiration for me. And as a director of a company that a few months after Jimmy was sent to jail was shut down forcibly by the government. Besides Jimmy, 6 other colleagues have been in jail for the last 4 years. And so I was driven, I was just driven by the need to do something to do what I could for my colleagues. But of course, it's become much more than that. A group of us founded the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, and based in Washington, D.C., but have an office in London as well as in DC. And those are our two main geographical focuses.
And what kind of work does the foundation focus on?
Yeah, well, we have kind of a 3-legged stool. We do research. We have some very powerful research that's come out that's shown the degradation really of rule of law in Hong Kong, with more work on the way. We work intensively with with governments, but especially with legislators, with Congress in the U.S. and with Parliament in the U.K. We also have contacts with the government, with the administrative side, but we're more focused on what parliamentarians and congressional members can do. And we do a lot of media and kind of, I guess you'd say, public work, whether it's writing articles, being interviewed, making sure that our reports get the attention they deserve, and that above all, that the spotlight stays on Hong Kong as much as we can. It's, on the one hand, it's a far off city. It's halfway around the world from where I sit in New York. It's a city of 7.5 million people. Its problems might not loom that large, but we think it's kind of a canary in a coal mine. And if China can, as it has done, break its promises to the people of Hong Kong, to the people of Britain, when Britain turned the colony back to China, and really to the world in terms of just tearing up international treaties, then China's behavior deserves to be called out, not just for Hong Kong and not just for the freedom of Hong Kong, but really for what it says about the ability of China to be trusted as an international partner. So I think what's happening in Hong Kong has an importance far beyond this small city on the southern edge of China.
As you noticed the encroachment of authoritarianism and the increased repression, why put your head above the parapet?
Hey, that's an interesting question. You read people and people. I've written a biography of Jimmy Lai called The Troublemaker that came out the end of last year, and people ask me, Jimmy in particular. I put my head above the parapet, but honestly, Theo, I haven't really had to suffer. I look at somebody like Jimmy who knew he was going to prison as far back as June 1997, a couple of weeks before the handover from Britain after 156 years of relative freedom as colonial subjects. Hong Kong was going back to the Chinese Communist Party, and Jimmy started a newspaper 2 years before that. Talk about putting your head above the parapet. A newspaper dedicated to freedom. The first time I met him in 1993, he walked me through the business case for that. It wasn't just that he believed in freedom, but he saw all the other publishers in Hong Kong cowering, starting to, protect themselves to not criticize China. And he said, I've got a market. 6 out of 10 Hong Kongers vote pro-democracy when they have a chance. The first chance they had was 1991. But he had a market, and he had it to himself. But still, why would you do that? So I saw him on stage in June 1997 with Al Newharth, the founder of USA Today, legendary head of the Gannett newspaper chain. And Newharth was kind of asking him about some of these questions. And Jimmy started crying. He said, I'm going to jail. I know I'm going to jail. He didn't know when, but he knew the risks he was running. So I look at a guy like that. And I've known him for 30 plus years. And I say, why does he was a billionaire until the Chinese started bleeding him of money. He's still quite wealthy. More to the point, he's been in solitary confinement for most of these past 4.5+ years, over 1,700 days as we talk. Why does a guy like that do it? And how can we, how can I, how can other people learn from him? And I think it really comes down to, whether he got it from his mother. As his biographer, I can kind of say this, or who, but he has a deep, deep sense of justice and what's right, absolute lack of fearlessness and a confidence in himself. I mean, a lack of fear, real sense of fearlessness. And he's just like, I'll do it. If I die in prison, I die in prison. I'll show the world what the Chinese Communist Party really is. And so I guess I'm kind of inspired, impelled by that. And, again, a sense of doing what I can, just of loyalty to Jimmy and the other executives who are in prison. But it's a funny journey, because when we started, they're not funny, but it's like you can't see it ahead of time. So when he was first thrown in prison about 4.5 years ago, or a little more than that, some of us who had lived in Hong Kong, Ambassador James Cunningham, who was a consul general there, went on to become ambassador to Afghanistan and Israel. So senior State Department guy. He and I and a few other people were like, okay, what can we do for Jimmy? And there had been other Democrats who'd been arrested, the so-called Hong Kong 47. Surely this must be some kind of a mistake. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has the Beijing Olympics coming up in 2022, and we'll have some media activities, maybe put up a few billboards or something, and surely the CCP will come to its senses and release these political prisoners, and maybe Hong Kong will be a little more restrictive, but, people can at least live freely. Well, I mean, we were wrong. We were naive. But once you get into these things, it's like, it's like you swim sometimes. I sometimes do polar bear swimming in the winter. And, that first dip in up to your knees is tough. It gets really tough when you're at your waist, and then you dive in and you're in, right? The difference is, when you're polar bear swimming, maybe you can stay in 5 minutes when the water's a few degrees Celsius. With this, we're really in it for the long haul. And I think you just, you keep swimming, you keep fighting. And, once you started, it's daunting before you've jumped in the water. And then when you're in, you're in.
When you were working as a journalist there, did you see repression start to increase slowly, or was it faster? Was it a boiling frog or a flicking switch?
Well, the funny thing about frogs is, in all the experiments, they jump out. They don't stay. They're smarter than the rest of us. The
whole saying just doesn't work, does it?
Well, no, it just shows frogs are smarter than people in some ways when it comes to these kind of reptilian responses. Well, I think, of course, we saw, as, I was lucky enough to, have that pre-97, pre-communist period, and also a period of, as I said, incredible flowering of a, political opening of a sort that Hong Kong had never seen in 150 plus years of British colonialism. So, yes, we saw it happening slowly. Then it happened all at once. And 2014, which is when protesters took over downtown Hong Kong and a couple other places for 79 days, that in the Occupy Central movement, the umbrella movement, that was obviously a major inflection point. And I think, although I would argue that the communists provoked that by their refusal to live up to their side of the bargain in terms of what they promised the people of Hong Kong, the British people, the people of the world, a move towards universal suffrage, continued freedoms that the Hong Kongers had been used to, and everything that, as you say, we pretty much take for granted in an open society. Then there was a kind of a simmering discontent for the next 5 years. And then in 2019, unprecedented demonstrations broke out. We would have as many as 2 million people. You think of this, 2 million people marching out on the streets in a city of 7.5 million people, where we were not drawing on the Chinese hinterland. You didn't have people coming from Beijing and Shanghai. In fact, the few that did often were harassed or arrested or worse when they returned. So you think of 2 million people, that's more than 1 out of every 4 people in Hong Kong coming out in support. So you had the entire city arrayed against the CCP and their quisling leadership in Hong Kong. And I think, and then at the end of that year, end of 2019 in November, there was a kind of a referendum. There were district council elections, which usually are a ho-hum affair. They're basically ward council members who control local trash and little local spending. Huge turnout. I think about close to 75%, over 70% turnout of registered voters. Unprecedented. I mean, even a normal election would hardly have that. Sweeping victory for the pro-Democrats. And if Xi Jinping and the old men in Beijing had any doubt about where the Hong Kongers' loyalties lay, I think after that they realized, okay, we've lost Hong Kong. We've got two choices. We could negotiate. These are actually pretty peaceful people who at the heart really just wanted to kind of run their own city the way they were promised. They wanted to elect the mayor and the city council. Even that Beijing couldn't stomach. So instead it just decided to replace Hong Kong, replace the DNA of Hong Kong, replace the leadership, in a way, replace the people. Hundreds of thousands of people have left since then. The entire, government infrastructure has been turned over, and the place is well on its way to becoming a national security state. So it happened. It's a bit like, was it Fitzgerald who said, or Hemingway who said about bankruptcy? It happened slowly and then all at once. And that's what happened over those 7 years or 5 years, really 5 or 6 years.
Why do you think they went down that route?
I don't think the CCP has any other playbook. They have no imagination. All they know is control. My formative years in Asia were in South Korea, and I happened to come to South Korea the beginning of June 1987. 8 days later, some demonstrations broke out. By the end of the month, the government had capitulated to the protesters' demands for free elections, for the release of political prisoners, for free speech, and set South Korea on an extraordinary road on the path to democracy. And I watched it happen during my 5 years in South Korea. That same summer, Taiwan lifted martial law. Summer of '87, lifted martial law for the first time in 4 decades. And so I saw what was happening. I was part of what was happening as a journalist covering it in Korea, in Taiwan, around Asia. We saw economic growth and political and social liberalization. And despite the 1989 killings and crackdown in China, I believed that China was on that road too. And I thought more economic growth, more integration would lead to more freedom. And I completely underestimated. And we all knew the Chinese were nasty and bad things were happening, but we thought that the trajectory was in the right direction, and we were wrong.
Do you think the concept from the end of the Cold War that economic liberalization inevitably leads on to political liberalization, can we put that to bed?
I don't think we can put it to bed, but we certainly need to wrap it in a lot of caveats.
Watching dictatorship, or at least military rule, fall away in South Korea, it's not often I get to ask the opposite question. So what was it like watching democracy begin to flourish again?
I mean, it's unbelievable. You can't, I mean, for me in particular, it was my first time to Asia, and I'd come through Hong Kong to meet with the people at the Far Eastern Economic Review that had hired me and sent me to South Korea. And we knew that there were kind of some student simmerings, and we knew this demonstration was going to happen, but most of the foreign press corps was like, oh, yeah, another demonstration. And yet then to watch tens and I guess in the end over 100,000 people come out, many of them middle-class people, not just students, to watch a popular upsurge swelling was just extraordinary. But I think what's more extraordinary, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's easy to get a demonstration out. It's not. It's really, really hard. But then to build on that, and we see what South Korea has done in the last 4 decades, and we see that democracy actually led to more prosperity. It didn't just lead to more freedom, but it's led to more prosperity. It's led to economic growth. It's led to creativity. I mean, think of the flowering of Korean culture. I mean, when I lived there would be these anguished articles in Yonhap, the news service. Do Koreans have a sense of humor? How can we, make the world understand Korea and our pain and our suffering? And, what can we do to, we're a shrimp among minnows. We're surrounded by Japan, China, Russia. The US is obviously our kind of guarantor. And now we look at the Korean films. I mean, the first foreign film to win a general, Academy Award Best Film was Parasite a couple of years ago. I mean, a crazy film, but one that actually really captures South Korea brilliantly, I think. But you think of, from K-pop to movies to fashion, you look at what freedom has done there. And so actually, to me, that's the more incredible thing, not just the demonstrations, but over 4 decades. And companies like Samsung, Hyundai, Kia, that are household names now, that were just these kind of like real wannabes. And, lots of countries have tried, but Korea did it. And so to watch that from the birth is just one of the greatest experiences of my life.
What's the value that you've found that journalism offers in combating authoritarianism and halting democratic backsliding, or at least attempting to?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think, having trained and worked as a journalist for a quarter century or so, you kind of take it for granted. The fact that you can ask anybody anything, you can more or less, within bounds, write what you like. You can hold power to account. You can speak truth to power. Yeah, I have to say, one of the sadder things about moving out of journalism is the extent to which I run across people, obviously business people, but also academics, who are just afraid. And I think at its best, journalists, and of course, there are many courageous academics, but not as many as you'd think, especially when it comes to dealing with, obviously I'm very concerned with China, but I think with authoritarian governments, but, China is really the worst, and it's the most brutal about enforcing, punishment on any kind of opposition. So I'm continually shocked at American academics who, in stories that I hear, and just, personal encounters, who are just really afraid of China, afraid of speaking truth to power. And so I think journalism is just, it is an incredible responsibility, but it's incredible freedom it's, one of the freest professions and occupations. I mean, you're supposed to hold people to account.
That is the job. Yeah. Why do you think those academics are afraid?
They want access. And there are journalists like this, and of course there are companies like that, but, they want, China controls visas very, very tightly. I know academics in Hong Kong or in China, they're afraid. I mean, they can't go back, and they can't go to their parents' funerals. I mean, I know the people who speak freely. I mean, you think of that. I mean, what kind of cruel, barbarous regime is this? China that talks about Confucian values and harmony and things. You can't go back for your mother's funeral, your father's funeral, because you're a novelist or a writer or an academic, and Chinese don't like what you're writing. I mean, there is a real cost.
We're seeing a growth of something that's being termed information laundering, where state media is giving content, giving stories to local broadcasters across the world for them to send out. And we're seeing a lot of this taking place in the global south. This is something that Russia is doing quite a lot of, and China is also on that game as well. But how much has China been involved?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm not in a position to quantify that, but I mean, clearly China's been using all sorts of asymmetric methods, whether it's, attacking people's websites, phishing, this information laundering you're talking about, particularly useful when you get, particularly effective when you get what I'd call useful idiots, right? After Lenin, you get foreigners in there, especially white foreigners from the US or the UK or Europe, saying how everything is nice in China, So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a narrative there. And let's be honest, China has had an extraordinary economic record, and it's brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's we're not talking about the old Soviet Union, where you kind of had to pretend everything was good and getting better. The high-speed trains are real. There's a real estate crisis, but there are a lot of buildings that were built. The apps, the technology, the use of AI. I mean, there are some really, really ugly sides to it. But if you're a government minister in the global south, and China offers to come, Huawei or ZTE offers to come in and build your telecoms network and allow both of you to have a little surveillance on the side, then why would you say no? China offers to come in and build roads and things. So we have our hands full in trying to combat this illiberal regime that like totalitarian fascist regimes everywhere often has some decent economic offerings.
It seems to me that the democracies are retreating from media spaces in the global south. I think Trump just fired most Voice of America journalists. What can we be doing?
Well, great. I mean, it's a great question.
Voice of America
Obviously,
yeah.
It's wonderful that people like you, that citizens, journalists, and others are doing what we can. I mean, talk about an own goal. I don't understand what the thinking was. I'm not an expert on Voice of America, but I can tell you Radio Free Asia was extraordinary. Talk about soft power. Why you want to do that? It's like amputating a limb. If you're going into a bar fight, you decide you're going to cut off your arm. I mean, I don't get it. And so I guess we're relying more and more on private initiatives, which have incredible passion, have a lot of freedom, and can actually do a lot. So let's keep going.
I want to ask a little bit about models of authoritarianism that you've seen, and specifically the model that you saw in Hong Kong. You write about a blueprint and that Beijing's tactics in Hong Kong form a model for the growth of authoritarianism elsewhere. Where else are you seeing that?
Well, I'd say the United Front. First of all, Hong Kong is unique in the sense that it was a sovereign part of Chinese territory, which was recovered after 1997, or at least it's now a sovereign part of it. Can talk about the historical antecedents, but we don't need to. And so there are People's Liberation Army troops there. The chief executive and other senior officials serve with the consent of Beijing. So that gives it a power that it doesn't have even in Taiwan, let alone in other places. But I think the United Front, which is I think Mao called it China's magic weapon, is a shadowy, partly above ground, partly underground organization that I think countries around the world, people around the world need to be alert to. And this tends to be, I guess I can talk about it a little more in the US, but it tends to be a mix of people who are directly taking orders and working with the Chinese government, and above ground organizations that tend to be community associations, often based around people from a particular province or a particular city, from Fujian or Guangzhou or Sichuan. And often the people there, some of them might not even like communism. They might just do it because they have to. They might do it because they're community spirited. But they are carrying out the work and the line. And as we all know, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is really focused on a line, whatever that line is, and whether it's relating to Hong Kong or Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang, these people will ensure that line is carried out. And again, it's often done with it's done in a clandestine, a secret way. In New York, we've seen it's an upcoming trial, so I guess she is still presumed innocent, but a woman named Linda Sun, who insinuated herself into the top ranks of the governor here and was able to stop senior officials from visiting Taiwan officials, was able to get certain resolutions passed that reflected Chinese policies. So, I think those are you mentioned before, the kind of information laundering. These are people who are that we kind of naively take as just normal, good citizens. And of course, we don't want to, the dangerous thing is you don't want it to slide into a racist, anti-Chinese kind of trope. But, I do think we have to be alert to the fact that people aren't always who they seem to be. They're often acting under the instructions, directly or indirectly, of a foreign power, China. We at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation recently came out with a report on the Greater Bay Area in Hong Kong, San Francisco area, and what they call the Greater Bay Area in Hong Kong, Macau, Pearl River Delta. And you see how local officials approach local officials in the Bay Area, and they act, you kind of think, oh, it's a mayor just like me. No, it's a mayor who's taking his orders from the Chinese Communist Party. And I think American elected officials, media people, ordinary people are often just very, very naive. Another case, a colleague of mine, Frances Hoy, who's subject to a bounty, over $100,000 for her capture and arrest and return to Hong Kong, testified in a federal court trial in Boston about a guy who was clearly working with the Ministry of State Security in China to harass her. The guy in the end was found innocent because he got a lot of support from local. Well, I would say he used the racism card. And got a lot of union support, kind of Asian American, Pacific Islanders kind of support. So, people aren't always who they seem. And I think we're too naive in taking people at face value when, in fact, they're representing really nefarious intent on the part of the Chinese Communist Party.
And we've just focused on being careful, not being naive. What would you say to those who argue that, bilateral engagement is going to be more effective than confrontation with the CCP?
Look, I think there's a room for bilateral engagement. Climate emergency is something that affects all of us. I think there are things that we can work on, but the CCP is often very, very skillful in saying, oh, we're not going to cooperate with you on climate or terrorism or nuclear proliferation if you're tough on us on these human rights issues. I think human rights and democracy should be at the core of all of our, the U.S., but I really mean the free world's interactions with totalitarian governments. It's like we have a bottom line. We're not going to let this slide. And I know this kind of comes and goes as a theme in American foreign policy, but I think we're stronger and we're more effective when we have human rights as a core issue, not as a peripheral sort of afterthought.
How do we balance that with geopolitical realities? For example, if we were to need the CCP's rare earth minerals or another country's oil, but they are a deeply unpleasant dictatorship.
Interesting question. Obviously, it's a case-by-case study, but let's take rare earths. We've had 10, 15 years knowing that the Chinese were going to try to make us dependent on them for rare earths. We didn't really do anything about it. I think it's time we need to wake up and have a clear-eyed view about where our vulnerabilities, our strategic vulnerabilities are with some of these physical hard assets that you're talking about. The U.S. is the biggest oil producer in the world, I believe, at this point. But anyway, it's certainly a major one. And we can work with, obviously, there's a lot of oil, there's a lot of fossil fuels in free countries. There are a lot of rare earths. There have been political obstacles to making those rare earths available, but they're available. Stepping back, why haven't we taken the hard-eyed, clear-eyed strategic assessment of where our vulnerabilities are? The Chinese sure have. They spent the last 3 decades preparing for confrontation with the U.S. I don't know what the U.S. has done in that point. There are a lot of smart people who've thought of a lot of things, but we don't have a kind of unified plan, let alone any kind of coherent, cohesive leadership approach to dealing with China.
And what's your take on the concept we see so often pushed? We saw it pushed at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting on Monday of multipolarity. Because I read that when said by people like Xi and Putin as, let us do what we want.
I think you're absolutely right. Look, the U.S. was not going to have the dominance that it had after 1945 forever. I think at one point we were a third or more of the global economy. It's good that that's changed. The rest of the world has grown. The rest of the world is, developed, has its own institutions. But the battle is between freedom and totalitarianism. And I think the free-loving world needs to pull together. I know that's hard, and we're not run by a bunch of people like Putin and Xi Jinping, but we do have a choice. We have choices, and I think it's very interesting to see India, which did seem to be coming more into, I don't want to say an American orbit, but an American kind of constellation. And now seems, Modi was there in Shanghai, hamming it up with Putin and Xi Jinping. So we can't take other countries for granted. I mean, we need a world that has freedom at the center and is attractive to other countries, and that means in terms of economic growth as well as more abstract concepts like freedom.
And you've mentioned it just now, this conflict between authoritarianism and democracy. I'm very glad you've mentioned it. We're seeing the CRINCs and others, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, coordinating more closely. You see North Korean soldiers fighting against the Ukrainians in Russia and also in Ukraine has been reported. And how do you see this cooperation going forwards?
Well, I honestly, I've been surprised and, of course, dismayed that it's gotten as far as it has. 10 years ago, if you told me that Russia and China would be cooperating to the extent they are, I wouldn't have believed it. I mean, it seemed, I spent a lot of time watching Russia-China relations, and, there was, going back to the Sino-Soviet split of the Maoist period, it's a very, very uneasy relationship, and it's one that's born of necessity, and Putin needs China now, and China is clearly the senior partner in all this. So I'm dismayed that it's gone as far as it has. But it's this meeting in Shanghai is I think a symbol of how the CRINCs and the authoritarians and the totalitarians are getting it together. I would hope that it would be a wake up call for the free world, and let's hope we can see the sort of leadership that we need. Usually times throw up the leaders that people need, but not always.
We've certainly seen that in Ukraine. Zelensky appeared to be the right man of that moment. But when it comes to the United States, unfortunately, we seem to be in rougher waters. Touching on India and India's relationship with the CCP, how much of a role did the tariffs Trump put on India for buying Russian oil play? And would it have been better to approach it with a carrot, say, subsidized American oil?
Yeah, I think it was the tariffs, but it's also the fact that Trump took credit for cooling tensions between Pakistan and India. And India's long had a policy of not countenancing third-party intervention in the Kashmir dispute. And so I think the combination of Trump saying he stopped this war, really hitting a kind of third rail in Indian foreign policy, with the tariffs on top of that, just it seems like calculated to push a guy who a few months ago looked like one of Trump's best friends.
Yeah.
To go to Shanghai and yuck it up with Putin and Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. I mean, it's just, again, it seems unnecessary. Seems like an own goal. I don't know if it's salvageable or not. I would hope so. I mean, look, it's now, I believe it is. Yeah, it's the world's most populous country as its population keeps growing. China's declining. It's always had a very non-aligned foreign policy. It's long had close relations with Russia, especially for military equipment. It's been very equivocal on the Ukraine issue. So, it's not like this is out of the blue, but it's a relationship that needs to be handled with care and the respect that a country like India deserves.
And I want to ask a bit about values and about the meaning of certain words. We've talked in this interview about freedom and democracy quite a lot and human rights, but what do those words mean to you? And what images, if any, do they conjure in your mind?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot about Jimmy Lai. He is somebody that, I didn't agree with him on a lot of things, but here was a guy who made his way in the world. He came up penniless immigrant who illegally entered Hong Kong, became one of its most successful business people, was almost a libertarian. I mean, he had lots of ideas that or other people might think are crazy, but why shouldn't he, just as any other human being, have the right to say what he thinks? And then you and I and everybody else can decide, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Do I want to buy his newspaper? Don't I want to buy his newspaper? I mean, it's freedom. He's not hurting anybody else. And so to me, it has a very concrete, I'm sure it has all sorts of abstract meanings. I'm an American. I feel proud when I look at the flag. I love looking at the Statue of Liberty. But really, freedom isn't those abstract things. For me, it's very, very concrete. It's the right to run a newspaper and say what you think without, having your staff thrown in jail and, hundreds of police coming in and shutting the place down. I mean, it's just the right to say what you think, believe in whatever God you want to believe in or not believe in a God at all. I mean, it's a really just human, personal thing. And yet, it's both very concrete and very abstract, and it's worth fighting for, because if we don't have that, I mean, we might as well just be animals.
Last I wrote about Jimmy Lai's case, the trial was coming to a close. What are the updates that you can give us?
So the trial, the closing arguments were held the last couple of weeks of August. The judges have now retired, I guess, to consider the verdict. Now, of course, we know the verdict is going to be guilty. That's no surprise. The surprise and the interesting thing will be to see how are they going to torture the law to throw a guy who believed in nonviolence, even if he believed in the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party, even if he believed in sanctions, although he's testified that he didn't. I mean, you mentioned sanctions before. It's a funny issue because they're mostly symbolic, but they really, really upset the Chinese and the Hong Kong authorities. And before the national security law came into effect in mid-2020, Jimmy had called for sanctions. And although he didn't do that after the law came into effect, they seemed to be persecuting him for sanctions and for just generally being a pain and calling for the end of the Chinese Communist Party totalitarian rule. So you get back to, what's freedom? Well, freedom's like, why shouldn't you be able to call for the end of democracy if you want? I mean, we're not going to throw you in jail for it. So the judges, we don't know when whether the verdict, we thought it was going to come in the first half of October. Now people are saying maybe it'll be Christmas time, could be early next year, but this is all speculation. I mean, we just don't know. What I do know is the judges are going to have to take some sort of fiction writing class to be able to find Jimmy Lai guilty. But their job is to find Jimmy Lai guilty. And I should also say that these were 3 handpicked judges. Jimmy was denied the right to a jury trial, which is in the Hong Kong Constitution. It was promised by the Chinese. He was denied his own lawyer. He wasn't able to bring in Tim Owen, a prominent human rights lawyer from London. So it's been a kangaroo court, and yet they'll find him guilty. He's in his late 70s. He'll get a minimum of 10 years, which is basically a life sentence for him. We just have to keep fighting to get him and the other 800 or so people who are political prisoners out of jail.
What makes them so sensitive to sanctions?
I think that's a great question because it has little practical impact, although in Hong Kong in particular, many people have properties abroad. They've got kids that go to school in the U.S., so it means, I can't go to my daughter's graduation, or, I can't, sell my condo in Hawaii, or I can't access my U.S. bank account. There are a lot of ties with the U.K. too, and I'd like to see the U.K. put more sanctions on Hong Kongers. But I think there's also just perceived slap in the face. Although the Chinese come back and put sanctions on some of my colleagues, as well as these bounties that I mentioned. So it's kind of a tit for tat thing. And yeah, the people I know have sanctions on them. They kind of yawn and say, yeah, whatever. I can't go to China. But for some reason, I don't know if it's some perceived power imbalance or asymmetry or kind of post-neo-colonial hangover or whatever, but it really seems to upset them.
Yeah, my colleagues working in Ukraine take it as a bit of a badge of honor when they're sanctioned by Russia. Yeah, you kind of go out for drinks, once you've gotten your ban notification. Right. And you've touched again on the people in democracies who might call for the end of democracy. And there are significant and growing numbers, it seems. If you type in the word democracy into TikTok, although it is through various routes and means sort of a CCP exercise, you find almost all negative videos, why democracy is bad, why it's not working, etc. And that's really affecting especially young people. In some YouGov polls around Europe is hovering at about 50% approval for democracy. What would you have to say to those people?
You don't know what you're talking about. But I understand your frustration because there are a lot of ways in which the liberal state, I don't know what we want to call it, hasn't delivered on its promise, right? Like on the one hand, since 1945 until, I don't know, let's say 2022, just pick a date, we had the most extraordinary economic expansion in history. We had relatively few conflicts and wars. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, of course, I'm not trying to minimize the suffering, the deaths, the violence, but on a global scale, it's incredible. We had more global cooperation. Maybe we had more globalization in the early 20th century, the years right before World War I. But extraordinary prosperity, and we, for much of the world, we solved the problem of hunger. We solved the problems of absolute poverty, not for the whole world. Billions of people got electricity. They could send their kids to school. They could get antibiotics. And yet, there's so many problems we haven't solved. And meanwhile, the state seems to be more and more in our lives. The state itself seems to have kind of failed. I mean, you look at, corruption, sclerosis, just a lot of things that haven't worked. You had, whether it was media or politicians or unions or companies, it seems like the haves keep getting more and the have-nots are certainly in relative terms falling way behind. So you look at, in the US, you look at what are the three issues that probably affect pretty much every family: healthcare, housing, education. Can't say any of them are big successes. And so you have somebody like an RFK Jr. coming along who's just like dismantling our healthcare system. And people are like, well, I get tired of wearing masks, So, I think there's a real frustration with the failures of the liberal state. But I think that shouldn't obscure like how far we've gotten. And, I'd hope that this very, very trying time right now might lead to some kind of rejuvenation, reinvigoration. I don't know where it's coming from, but we're certainly ripe for change. And I've seen, not just the election of Trump, but the re-election of Trump after the January 6th violence is extraordinary to me. But it shows that you've got, many, many tens of millions of Americans who are really fed up with the old order. Unfortunately, that sometimes means, you sweep away, throw the baby out with the bathwater, we'd say. And, that, of course, is the danger. You throw out liberal institutions, you throw out what is working, and you end up with a more authoritarian, if not totalitarian response. So, don't know.
How does the state of this conflict between democracy and authoritarianism look in your eyes? Who's coming out on top, and is it as bad as you've seen it?
Well, it's certainly as bad as I've seen it. And people, I'm in my late 60s. There are people 10, 15, 20 years older than me who say it's as bad as anything they've seen. I mean, I certainly don't think there's, we can say, quote unquote, which side is winning. Certainly democracy is under an enormous amount of pressure. I believe in the strength and the ultimate, triumph of human freedom, because I think that is what drives us, when our basic needs for, particularly for food and shelter and, physical needs are met, we want something more. And, we want freedom. Even people who are, in more authoritarian countries who want more stability, they don't want other people telling them what to do, or especially a state. So I remain optimistic, but it's not, look, it's not easy. And I mean, it takes all of us continuing to fight, continuing to realize what's at stake. And so whether we're fighting in China or somewhere else, in Ukraine, in Iran, North Korea, it's probably pretty tough to fight. But I mean, and I think, one of the things that when it comes to Hong Kong is, getting back to that, there's 7.5 million people in Hong Kong. I believe that 6 out of 10 of them would support democracy and freedom, just as they have in every election from 1991 until 2019, when free elections ended. And yet people in Hong Kong, they're thrown in jail from wearing the wrong T-shirt or not looking, reverent enough when the Chinese national anthem is being played. So it requires those of us who are in free countries to do what we can to fight for those who can't. And so whether it's North Korea or it's Iran or it's Hong Kong or China or Burma, there's a lot that those of us in free countries can do. And above all, we need to make sure that the world doesn't forget and keeps the spotlight on these places and keeps the spotlight on the real sufferings that people are undergoing.
Going back to Hong Kong, thank you for leading me back there. I read an analysis some months ago that, to very much summarize what they were saying, that the CCP has risked, killing the goose that lays the golden eggs in their enormous repressions on Hong Kong. When I was, younger, you consider the financial centers of the world. You thought, well, New York, London, Hong Kong, and now Hong Kong seems to have fallen off of that list.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The CCP thinks they can have it both ways. They think they can, I guess, muzzle the goose, and yet it'll still continue to lay golden eggs. And I think the jury is very much out on that. I mean, from a CCP perspective, you look at the market for new stock offerings, for initial public offerings. The IPO market in Hong Kong will probably be the world's largest this year. There are some very specific reasons for that, including the fact that Hong Kong and Chinese companies really can't raise capital abroad anymore. But I think that Hong Kong has an importance to the CCP far beyond what they want to admit, because it brings in technology, it brings in capital. As our research at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation has shown, it's a major smuggling place. It actually, we believe that, and have demonstrated that Hong Kong is the world's most important place for smuggling technology that's used by Russia to kill Ukrainians. And it's going to Iran, it's going to Russia, and it's coming through Hong Kong, trading on the 150 plus years as a British colony when it established its bona fides. And it still is trying to masquerade as a place that's governed by rule of law. And that's why there's a whole charade with Jimmy Lai's trial, is they want to make it look like it's a normal place, like a New York or a London. I think they're in real danger of hurting themselves, and that Hong Kong is increasingly going to be cut off from the flows of global finance. And that actually is going to have a damage for the Chinese economy that's way beyond what most people expect.
And where do you think the future of Hong Kong lies? I mean, it's a huge question. And you don't have a crystal ball, but as much as you can.
Well, yeah, I think that Hong Kong, as always, is dependent on China. And where China goes, Hong Kong follows. And so we can see that right now with the dismal economic performance. Some of the largest companies in Hong Kong, property companies, are struggling under huge debts, just as we see this slow motion train wreck of the real estate crisis in China that's destroyed hundreds of billions of dollars in capital and still isn't nearly over. And so we see that financially. And I think, of course, we see it politically. I mean, Hong Kong, even under the British period, never had a real autonomy to have its own political development. And I think, unfortunately, as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power in China, Hong Kong's room for autonomy is extremely limited.
I always have a narrative plan for these interviews, and as always, it lies shattered on the floor in various pieces. And so I'm going to take us on another complete non sequitur and ask, this incredible career in journalism you've had, and getting into journalism is very difficult. What is your advice for young journalists, and what is it they should do when they see a very attractive job offering from, say, CGTN?
Interesting. I have never had that question before. First, I think journalism is an incredible profession. It's a noble profession. It's very tough. The economics of it are, really, really difficult right now. On the other hand, I mean, there are lots of ancillary ways in which people can tell stories. I mean, obviously, somebody like you doesn't have to have a gatekeeper of some, old guy at a national daily who was preventing you from doing the interviews you want. Going to CGTN, I'm not sure what I'd say. I wouldn't say don't do it, because you can learn a lot. And actually, one of my colleagues spent some time working for CCTV, and I mean, saw a side of China that she wouldn't have seen otherwise. So, definitely go in with your eyes open, keep good notes, and try to keep your integrity and your wits about you, and don't stay too long if you go. I'm not saying you should go, but I wouldn't say don't go. I mean, it also depends on personal safety. Who else around you can have pressure put on them. I mean, one of the things that I find saddest and cruelest really is what the CCP does to family members. I mentioned before, people who can't go back when their parents die. There are political prisoners in Hong Kong are losing their parents, and they're not let out to go to the funerals, or only let out under extremely tight conditions. And I've seen with Hong Kong Chinese colleagues the pressure that's put on people's relatives that are still in China. So there are people who have bounties on their head, and their parents, they can't get the activists abroad. They go after their parents in Hong Kong. So if you are going to go work for CGTN, just make sure you understand what the pressure points are. And unfortunately, they're a lot more severe on people of Chinese heritage, and people who have families still in China or Hong Kong.
And my final question often eludes quite a short and sharp response. Some have been quite considered, actually, and others have been, I've had to add the explicit notification to the podcast. But do you have a message for the dictators and the authoritarians of the world?
You know that people are against you. That's why you're fighting so hard, because people don't want what you have to offer. That's why people are risking their freedom, their lives, their physical safety, their jobs, money. They risk everything because what you have to offer is anathema to the human spirit.
Dr. Clifford, thank you very much indeed. That's it for this episode of Why We Fight. What struck you most about their story? What did you agree or disagree with? Drop a comment and let us know. And if this conversation meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who cares about democracy as much as you do. To get early access and support independent journalism, join us on Patreon or Substack. Links are in the description. And if you want to connect with a global community of people who care about freedom and human rights, come hang out with us on Discord. Until next time, remember, democracy is non-negotiable.